wanted to do, given what I take to be the nature of this group and the big topic in limited time, is to give you a sense of where I think the rule of law and its prospects are in China, and where the state of play among people who watch this closely and participate in it is. And so I'm going to do something that's a bit more, I think, impressionistic. I'm going to give you a bunch of views of the beast, as it were. And you can decide whether we grab the elephant by the tail or the trunk or the foot or whatever. And hopefully it will enlighten in some way or another as soon as I figure out how to work this PowerPoint. I can do this for page down. This first crowded slide is meant to suggest the difficulty of the topic we're facing. The rule of law is kind of like the weather. Everyone talks about it, but nobody does anything about it. It's a much contested term. And much of the critical take on the rule of law, or the lack of rule of law in China, really measures it against a particular conception that is quite narrow and quite rooted in an almost idealized version of Anglo-American or European-style law. So you see definitions of the rule of law which stress judicial or even constitutional review with fully independent and autonomous courts, the idea of full legal accountability of officials, government under law, constitutional allocations and grants of authority to government entities, and reliable enforcement of lawful economic and private arrangements. A perfectly fine definition, to be sure, and one to which we can all aspire. But in some ways, to ask whether we are there yet, or anyone is there yet, is to miss some of the interesting questions. If you look at the discussions about the role of law and the rule of law that have come down in the reform era in the PRC, they really begin with, of course, Deng Xiaoping and the third plenum of the 11th Central Committee with the famous 16-character slogan that says China needs more laws, the laws need to be followed, they need to be strongly implemented. And this really launched a wave of legal reform that we're still seeing unfolding today, and it's a huge change from the baseline preceding that era. We get into the Jiang Zemin years, of course, we get phrases like ruling the country by law, law. We get the socialist rule of law state, the constitutionalization of these principles, and finally, Hu Jintao, I think, set a new record for the number of times he mentioned the word law at his 17th Party Congress address. So it's clearly there in the discourse, but it's not quite the same thing you see in the rule of law purveyors from the outside world. And if you look at some of the most recent, more fine-grained, more specific discussions of the topic, there are things that have given rule of law proponents some pause and some concern. Hu Jintao himself has said that as China's political system evolves, it will not have a Western-style separation of powers. There was a call for a very Western-style constitution in Charter 08 about a year ago. That has met with an unhappy end, most recently with the indictment of the person most prominently associated with it. And then you saw Luo Gan, who was Zhou Yongtang's predecessor as the law portfolio holder on the Politburo Standing Committee, who at one point warned that autonomous laws and legal institutions modeled on the West were a potential color revolution for China and something to be resisted. And in my little world, everyone is all exercised about the significance of going from Xiaoyan to Luncheon as the head of the Supreme People's Court, and having articulated the doctrine of the three supremes, that is, the courts should look to public opinion, policy, and law, perhaps in that order, rather than what had been the Xiaoyan argument for a more rule of law type approach. So that's the broad framing thing. What I want to do now is turn to a series of glimpses of Chinese reality as best we can grasp it. And one macro measure is the Rule of Law Index that the World Bank puts out every year. It ranks every country in the world. And China does pretty well by these standards. It's somewhere in the mid-40s in terms of percentile rank globally. It's not far behind the East Asia average, which is a bit above the world median. It does a lot better than the former Soviet states, and not too far below the Eastern European part, Central and Eastern European part of the former Soviet bloc. A little bit behind India. The British Commonwealth gets some credit for that. And it's basically on par with many of the countries in Southeastern Europe and Latin America. Of more interest for those who look at the big comparative world historical trends, if you will, China is actually above the median rank for rule of law for countries in its lower middle income group. So if you think money matters for these things, that helps. So these data are obviously qualitative and impressionistic. It's very large macro comparisons, and it's based on surveys. You can quibble with it, but by and large, it gives us one glimpse of a relatively positive, if not overwhelming, picture. This is, you probably can't see it at the back of the room, but this is China graphically in context. Here's China arranged among several East Asian countries. Here's China compared to the largest economies in the world, the developed ones, and the rich countries. So what I wanted to do now is take a somewhat more fine-grained look at the ambiguous, and I would say they really are ambiguous, measurements or metrics we have of China's stated rule of law. 4.5 million civil suits a year. That is a huge number by pre-reform standards and by even early reform era standards, but not that many in a country of 1.3 billion. 40% of judgments are enforced or partially enforced in China. That number, it turns out, isn't far off what we think goes on in the US. So again, it's very hard to measure what exactly these mean. There's been a lot of interesting scholarship in recent years that looks into litigant perceptions. How satisfied are litigants with their experience in Chinese courts? And here the news has gotten somewhat more positive in recent years. One interesting survey says that the best predictor of whether you will litigate in China is whether someone you know has litigated. That suggests a kind of benevolent view of what goes on. Then there's another somewhat more ambiguous survey that I find quite interesting, which is litigants were asked, did you engage in anything that was corrupt or might be seen as trying to get the court to come out in a way that is not proper under the law? And the vast majority of respondents in this Shanghai survey said, oh, no, I didn't. Did the other side? Oh, yes, they did. So I don't know quite what to make of that one. Is self-reporting or other reporting is more reliable? But if you look at these things, there is at least a mixed picture. And much of the discussion very recently has been about a phenomenon of the plateauing of litigation rates. They're not going up the way they used to, and indeed they have started to decline some. And this presents a really difficult interpretive problem. The pessimistic view says people have learned that the court system doesn't really work and they're frustrated and they're turning away from it. There's a more optimistic view that says actually things have gotten to be a little more predictable. People don't bring as many weak cases. And then there is the one that some of my lawyer friends on the mainland like to point out, which is their services have gotten more expensive. So people are perhaps more reluctant to litigate some of these things. But by and large, you have this, again, a mixed picture which says a lot of suits, but maybe not so many by base rates of behavior that it might regulate. Administrative litigation is another area with similar ambiguity. On the one hand, nearly 100,000 suits a year. That's a fair amount to try to hold government officials to account. On the other hand, that is a very small number given what we think is the base rate of administrative misbehavior, government misbehavior in China. Back on the positive hand, 20 to 40% of the plaintiffs who bring these claims win. And that's a very high rate internationally. That's higher than you'll find in most Western countries. But again, we don't know quite what the what screen is being used. Is it only people who have very strong cases go forward, or is it people who are acting in desperation and have no other real hope and are therefore going to the courts and perhaps getting some redress? The other phenomenon that makes it hard to evaluate these administrative litigation rates is that we don't know what happens outside the cases that actually get brought and settled. And there are sociological and anthropological, even anecdotal surveys that suggested that now cadres at the local level worry a great deal about administrative claims being brought against them, so the threat to bring a claim can induce a remedial action, a desire to avoid the controversy. On the other hand, there are also many reports of suppression and retaliation against those who dare to bring claims against officials. So again, some rather ambiguous metrics, unfortunately. Then there are the many ways in which legal claims are brought not through the formal legal system, the so-called letters and visits, the Xinfang process. 4 to 8 million of those a year. Many things that are even brought to court get shunted off into mediation of the Jiaojie process, which has gotten new emphasis under Luncheon as the new head of the Supreme People's Court. A number of lawyers, 150,000, a fair amount of legal services, far more than used to be the case, but again, very small. That's 1%, I think, of the rate you find in a place like the US, which probably has too many lawyers.